There are battles that don't just decide the fate of a single front, they bring down an entire empire. In the summer of 1944 in Belarus, a place the Germans believed to be the safest, more than 25 divisions vanished in less than 3 weeks. Not a retreat, not a defeat, but a total erasure. This wasn't Stalingrad. It wasn't Kursk. This was the moment the Wehrmacht would never recover from. If you want to understand how an army once thought to be invincible could collapse so quickly, and how the Red Army laid the most perfect trap of World War II, stay with us for today's story. And if you love history told slowly, deeply, and true to the nature of war, don't forget to subscribe to History War so you never miss the moments that changed the world. Because history doesn't always begin with the sound of gunfire. Sometimes it begins with a silence so long that people start to believe the war, at least here, had forgotten them. In the spring of 1944, Belarus lay under a strange kind of peace. The young birch forests, the muddy roads thawing after winter, the gray wooden villages stained with smoke. Everything looked almost unchanged from the year before, or even 2 years before that. This front didn't see the blazing breakthroughs like in Ukraine, nor the brutal tank battles of Kursk, and certainly not the panicked retreats of Stalingrad. It was still, and in that stillness there was a comfort, one dangerously deceptive. To many German soldiers, Belarus felt like a pause. Not a real rest, but a slower breath in the drawn-out death of the Eastern War. They patrolled familiar roads, rebuilt old guard posts, sipped watery coffee inside homes that had changed hands more than once. Some even believed that if the war dragged on for a few more years, Belarus would stay just like this, cold, dull, but stable. Letters sent home didn't speak of doomsday. They talked more about boredom than fear, about how nothing really happens here, how the Red Army seems exhausted, how this front isn't Moscow's priority. Military reports echoed the same tone. The situation is under control, the defenses are firm, the enemy shows no sign of preparing for a major operation. That belief stretched from the trenches all the way up to the high command. In the eyes of the German general staff, Belarus was so familiar it had become dull. A front they had measured, analyzed, and assessed for 3 straight years. A place where every stretch of river, every forest, every village had been mapped, logged, and memorized by officers up and down the ranks. And when people become too familiar with a place, they start to confuse familiarity with safety. Few bothered to ask one simple but fatal question. If this was truly the weakest front, why had it remained untouched for 3 whole years? The Red Army's silence only made the illusion more convincing. There were no long preparatory bombardments, no large conspicuous reconnaissance missions, none of the usual signs the Germans relied on to anticipate an attack. The Belarus front looked like a still lake, flat, calm, and giving no warning of the storm beneath. But in war, total silence is rarely a sign of peace. More often, it's a sign of focus. While German troops carried on in their daily routines, while reports continued to close with the word stable, on the other side, an enormous force was silently shifting into place. No noise, no spectacle, like a tide pulling far back from shore, only to come crashing in. And in less than 3 weeks, the entire world they thought they knew would vanish. Not in an orderly retreat, not in a controlled fallback, but in a cascading collapse. More than 24 divisions would be wiped from the order of battle. Hundreds of thousands of men would disappear into inescapable encirclements. An entire army group, the backbone of the Eastern Front, would dissolve as if it had never existed. The most terrifying thing wasn't the scale of the disaster, but where it happened. Not on the legendary battlefields already written into history. Not in the hotspots tracked hour by hour, but in Belarus, the stable front, the familiar front, the front no one thought would decide the fate of the Third Reich. That operation was called Bagration. And to understand how this blow could be so devastating, we have to go back to the root of the fatal mistake, the illusion of Belarus, where familiarity was mistaken for safety and a surface calm masked a storm waiting to erupt. Belarus wasn't just a location on Nazi Germany's military map. For the soldiers stationed here since 1941, it had become so familiar, so routine, that it dulled their sense of danger. The slow rivers winding through the marshes, the dense forests that blocked all vision, the squat wooden villages. They repeated winter after winter, summer after summer, until war here began to feel more like a habit than a matter of life and death. For nearly 3 years, the front line in Belarus barely moved. After the failed push toward Moscow, the Germans pulled back, dug in, fortified, and adapted. What began as temporary trenches turned into permanent homes. Wood and earth bunkers were reinforced season after season, layer upon layer, until many soldiers believed they were permanent. In a war defined by constant motion, this stillness bred a strange sense of safety. People tend to believe that anything that lasts long must be durable. Over time, Belarus came to be seen as a settled front, not in the sense of a victory, but in the sense that it was known, understood, and under control. The Germans knew where the Red Army had attacked, where it had failed, and how it had struggled with the forests and swamps. They believed the Soviets wouldn't repeat the same mistakes, that Moscow would choose easier, more valuable targets. In every strategic forecast Berlin made in early 1944, the focus lay to the south. Ukraine with its open plains, oil fields, and strategic routes toward the Balkans, or further north in the Baltics, offering access to the sea and posing a direct threat to East Prussia. Belarus, sitting quietly in between, was seen as a passive buffer, not enticing enough for a major offensive, but tough enough to discourage one. That very logic fed the most dangerous illusion of the entire war. If the enemy didn't want to fight here, then this place must be safe. This illusion didn't form overnight. It built up over quiet seasons, over small, inconsequential skirmishes. Each time the Red Army launched a limited attack and then stopped, each time the German lines held, the belief only grew stronger. Belarus became a symbol of order on a front otherwise drowning in chaos. But that same familiarity blurred the warning signs. Reports of rising Soviet partisan activity were dismissed as a rear security issue, not a sign of a broader campaign. The increasing number of Red Army reconnaissance flights were waved off as routine. The long, quiet nights, no artillery, no probing, only reinforced the belief that the enemy was worn out. Few realized that the silence itself was the anomaly. In war, especially on the Eastern Front, where every inch of land was paid for in blood, total silence rarely lasts without purpose. But for a command structure trained to anticipate the enemy based on past patterns, Belarus simply didn't seem worth worrying about. The problem was this: Germany was assessing this front through the lens of the past, while the Soviet Union was preparing for it with the mindset of the future. The Red Army of 1944 was no longer the clumsy force of 1941, nor the rigid one of 1942. But in Belarus, the Germans still viewed them through that outdated lens, a slow, heavy-handed opponent that relied on numbers over sophistication. And that misjudgment caused every sign of a major buildup to be dismissed or misinterpreted. The longer the illusion lasted, the more solid it felt. Junior officers began to believe the front would remain unchanged until the war's end. Defensive plans weren't drawn to withstand a devastating blow, but simply to preserve the status quo. Everything revolved around maintaining what was, not preparing for what was coming. But history doesn't punish weakness immediately. It punishes complacency. Beneath that surface calm, the German army in Belarus was already beginning to crack. Defensive lines that looked solid on paper were being held together by habit and hope, not by actual strength. The units were still standing, but they were under strength. The artillery was still in position, but running short on shells and men. The officers were still issuing commands, but increasingly out of touch with the realities on the ground. Belarus looked like a strong front, only because it hadn't been properly tested, and so when the test came, the shock would be catastrophic. When people confuse familiarity with safety, they tend to ignore the most important question of all. Is what's standing still actually strong enough to withstand a blow? For the German forces in Belarus, that question was never seriously asked. Not because they weren't smart, but because they had lived too long inside a false sense of order. An order that hid the fact that the army behind those familiar trenches was no longer the army of the early war. It was no longer whole, no longer nimble, no longer capable of absorbing a massive strike. But outwardly, everything still looked the same, like a neatly pressed uniform covering a body that was wasting away. And right at the intersection between that illusion of stability and the reality of collapse, we begin to see the shape of the coming disaster. Because when war stops testing an army for too long, the first thing to die isn't its weapons, it's its will to live. Belarus wasn't just a misjudged front. It was a place where a hollowed-out army stood frozen, draped in the cloak of order, waiting for the moment when all its weaknesses would be exposed at once. In Belarus 1944, the German army still stood in familiar formations with insignias, uniforms, and a command structure that appeared unchanged. From a distance, it looked like a machine still operating under the same old order. But step closer, descend into the trenches, and look into the faces of the men who had been here since the first winter of the invasion, and you would see a different truth. This machine was running on inertia, not strength. On paper, everything seemed intact. A standard German infantry division was still listed at 12,000 men. Reports still showed full rosters, the right symbols, the right names. But wars aren't won on paper. On the front lines of Belarus, many divisions were down to half strength. Some units didn't even have enough men to fill the defensive positions laid out years ago. Companies lacked soldiers, battalions lacked platoons. And those gaps were hidden by stretching the lines thinner, by hoping nothing's going to happen here. The men who remained carried the weight of 3 unbroken years of war. They no longer had the excitement of conquerors in 1941, nor the bitter resolve of 1942. What was left was a quiet fatigue, the kind that builds and builds until each day becomes a battle against one's own body and mind. Many had grown so used to death that it no longer shocked them. But that familiarity didn't give them strength. It drained it. Their equipment told the same story. The heavy artillery that once symbolized the Wehrmacht's power had been pulled away, redirected to fronts considered more urgent. The remaining tanks sat behind the lines, immobile, low on fuel, short on spare parts. The Luftwaffe, which once ruled the skies over the east, now appeared only sporadically, too few to scout, too weak to defend. Meanwhile, Soviet planes flew more frequently, low and slow, almost tauntingly, and met no real resistance. But the most dangerous issue wasn't numbers or firepower. It lay in the mindset of the command structure. After the shocks of previous years, especially Stalingrad, Berlin chose absolute control. Every major decision was centralized, and that center grew increasingly detached from the reality on the ground. The order, no retreat, became doctrine. Cities were declared fortresses, not because of tactical value, but because they symbolized control. Holding them meant preserving the illusion that things were still under command. In reality, those fortresses became traps. Once surrounded, they lost all defensive value and simply became death zones. But in Belarus, the orders still came down like gospel. Frontline commanders knew they faced a false choice: follow orders and be crushed, or disobey and risk political consequences, perhaps even their lives. Yes, the structure still existed, but it was a rigid one, no longer capable of adaptation. The defensive lines were built on old experience, sufficient to repel small-scale attacks, but completely inadequate for a deep, modern breakthrough. German war doctrine had once been about mobility, flexible counterattacks, and combined arms. But in Belarus, 1944, mobility was forbidden, counterattacks were underpowered, and coordination had broken down due to a lack of resources and information. Each unit became its own isolated island, connected to others by fragile lines of communication, and by a shared belief that the larger machine was still functioning. But when even one part of the machine is exhausted, the entire system collapses faster than anyone expects. The tragedy is that this decline didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, so slowly that people learned to live with it. Each day brought the loss of a few more men, a few more guns, a few more vehicles. Each month deepened the fatigue, and eventually, what was once unusual became the new normal. An understrength division was no longer a crisis, it was just standard. Outwardly, the Wehrmacht in Belarus still appeared disciplined. Ranks were still held, orders still followed, symbols of authority still in place. But inside, it was an army surviving on the memory of itself, on the memory of when it was faster, stronger, and more decisive. And that memory created the illusion that they could still withstand anything. Meanwhile, on the other side, there were those watching very closely. The Soviets didn't see an unbreakable wall of steel in Belarus. They saw an overstretched, outdated structure, held together more by belief than by strength. They saw units that couldn't move, commanders bound by distant orders, and fragile supply lines. Most importantly, they saw an enemy so used to quiet, they no longer expected disaster. That contrast wasn't accidental. It was the result of two paths that had diverged completely. While the Wehrmacht clung to the image of the old order, the Red Army had undergone a brutal rebirth. Their early failures had forced them to learn, adapt, and change the very way they waged war. By 1944, they weren't seeking symbolic victories. They were engineering systematic destruction. And to do that, they needed more than raw strength. They needed a trap subtle enough that the enemy wouldn't see it until it was too late. A trap not based on surprise in the first few hours, but on the complacency built up over years. A trap constructed not with steel and concrete, but with information, deception, and cold patience. As German divisions in Belarus kept wearing the cloak of order, believing they still held the initiative, in Moscow, strategic minds were quietly assembling the pieces of a larger puzzle. There, no one believed in the surface stability of the German front. They believed in data, in patterns, in weaknesses observed for months. And it was from that contrast between an exhausted army clinging to the past and a war machine preparing for the final blow that the perfect plan began to take shape. A plan that, once unleashed, would expose every hidden weakness in Belarus at once and leave no escape for those who had convinced themselves they were still safe. On the other side of that quiet front, hundreds of kilometers away, the war moved to a different rhythm. There were no damp trenches, no endless shifts in the woods. In Moscow, war existed inside sealed rooms, under dim yellow lights, where maps blanketed the tables, and a single pencil stroke could decide the fate of tens of thousands. There, Stavka didn't look at Belarus through the eyes of routine. They saw it as an unsolved equation. After 3 years of war, the question was no longer how to push the Germans back step by step. The question was how to shatter their entire structure. Not a symbolic victory, not a counteroffensive to regain territory, but a blow so devastating that the enemy couldn't recover. A strike that wouldn't just slow the German war machine, but break it apart. In those closed-door meetings, the issue wasn't framed in the usual way. Where can we gain the most ground? It was framed with colder logic. Where can we strike so that the enemy cannot escape? Belarus slowly emerged as the unexpected answer. Not because it was easy to reach. On the contrary, its forests and swamps had been a nightmare for the Red Army in the early years. But that was precisely why it made the perfect trap. A place the enemy believed they understood best, a front that looked the most solid, and a place where, if collapse began, it could spread like wildfire across the entire Eastern Front. Stavka knew they couldn't win by simply piling in troops and charging forward. The Wehrmacht had survived blows like that before. What was needed was a strike the enemy wouldn't see coming, wouldn't know where it would land, and wouldn't know how to respond when it did. So the first phase of the war was conducted in silence. Soviet deception doctrine, once underappreciated, had now evolved into an art form. Not crude feints, but a full-scale performance across the entire front. False signals were deliberately sent out. Troop movements were made obvious, exactly where the Germans expected an attack. Ukraine, the Baltics, everything was crafted to reinforce what the enemy already believed. Meanwhile, the real preparation happened in the shadows. Entire army groups were moved mostly at night. Marching routes were hidden beneath forest canopies. Artillery was dragged into position and camouflaged so thoroughly that from the air it was just an unbroken patch of green. Fake airfields, fake tanks, fake depots sprang up where no attack was planned. Meanwhile, in Belarus, everything was concealed so well it seemed to vanish from reconnaissance altogether. This wasn't just physical preparation, it was psychological. Stavka knew the Germans were viewing them through outdated assumptions, and they fed that lens. Each day that passed without a major move in Belarus was another day the Germans' confidence grew. Every report stamped nothing unusual was more step toward the completion of the trap. The biggest difference from past campaigns was the ultimate objective. This wasn't going to be a breakthrough that stopped at a certain point. It was a systematic encirclement, designed to crush each section of the front, to isolate German formations, and to leave no path for an orderly retreat. Every axis of the Soviet attack was calculated to support the others, Every gap in the German defenses had been mapped. There would be no improvisation when the assault began. Everything had to move like a machine, not a rigid one run by distant commands, but a living organism capable of adapting within a carefully prepared framework. For months, Stavka waited. Not because they weren't ready, but because they needed the enemy to believe, truly believe, that no attack was coming. That patience was something the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. They had grown used to the quiet, used to nothing happening, so much so that they no longer knew how to be alert. Once all the pieces were in place, only one thing remained: the timing. June 22, 1944 was no random choice. It carried heavy symbolic weight, exactly 3 years since the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union. A full circle of history, but this time, the roles of attacker and defender had been completely reversed. On the German side, there were no signs of what was coming. Units followed their daily routines. Commanders believed that if anything happened, they'd have time to respond. No one imagined that what was approaching wasn't just a battle, but the complete collapse of everything they'd relied on. On the Soviet side, silence reached its final absolute form. There were no probing bombardments, no small attacks to soften the lines. Everything waited for a single moment when the gates of hell would open all at once across the entire front. And that moment came on what seemed like an ordinary morning. Before the sun had even risen above the forests of Belarus, before the German soldiers could sense what was different in the air, war shifted into a new form, a form with no room for mistakes, no space for retreat, and no mercy for those still clinging to memories of the past. Everything Stavka had prepared for months, the patience, the deception, the cold precision, was aimed at a single instant. The moment when the long silence was shattered and the familiar world of the German army in Belarus disappeared beneath the roar of tens of thousands of Soviet guns. June 22, 1944. Hell opened. The morning of June 22, 1944 began like countless others in Belarus. A thin mist drifted low across the damp forests, obscuring the view between the trenches. The air was so still you could hear footsteps on soft earth, the faint clink of metal as a soldier adjusted his rifle strap. For many German soldiers, this was just another day in an endless war, perhaps dull, but familiar, and therefore safe. There were no warning signs, no scattered artillery shots, none of the usual harassment fire that might precede an attack. That silence, so long it became unnatural, was the final piece of the trap. Then at dawn, the world collapsed. Not a series of distant explosions, but a single unbroken roar, heavy, violent, as if the earth itself had split apart. More than 30,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously across the entire front. The forests were shredded, the ground erupted like ocean waves. German trenches shook violently, and communication lines were severed within minutes. The soldiers, accustomed to artillery fire, this time couldn't tell where the front ended and the rear began. Everything blended together in a storm of noise and flame. Many memoirs would later describe that moment as apocalyptic. Not simple fear, but total disorientation. Everything they believed to be stable, solid, familiar, dissolved in a matter of minutes. Fortifications built over years were pulverized so quickly that no one had time to process what was happening. Places once considered safe became the epicenter of destruction. When the artillery stopped, silence did not return, only a new kind of war began. In the skies, waves of ground attack aircraft appeared, flying low and slow, as if they knew no one could stop them. They swarmed over supply lines, command posts, staging areas, turning any attempt at organizing a response into chaos. On the ground, Soviet infantry and armor advanced, not in isolated charges, but in carefully calculated thrusts aimed straight at the weakest points in the German line. Positions once deemed solid collapsed with almost no resistance, not due to a lack of courage, but a lack of everything else: manpower, firepower, communication, and mobility. German commanders struggled to grasp the situation. Information was slow, fragmented, and contradictory. Maps became useless as units vanished from their marked positions in a matter of hours. Orders from above, already delayed, were obsolete the moment they were issued. What was thought to be a continuous front turned out to be a string of disconnected outposts, and once attacked all at once, they couldn't support one another. The most terrifying part wasn't the force of the initial blow. It was the realization that nothing could be done to stop it. There were no reserves strong enough to plug the gaps, no air force to reclaim the skies, no authority to retreat and establish a new defensive line. All that remained was instinct. Hold your position, even if that position no longer had any tactical meaning. Within the first day, massive gaps had opened in the German lines. The Soviet thrusts didn't stop to consolidate. They pushed deeper, cutting communication lines and isolating entire German formations. War, which had moved slowly for years in Belarus, suddenly shifted to a blinding pace. What had taken years to build was destroyed in mere hours. And with that speed came a chilling realization among German troops. This was not a typical offensive. This was a hunt. Not a hunt for individual units. A hunt for the entire structure. Every Soviet advance wasn't just about gaining ground, but about tightening the noose. Every severed road didn't just slow reinforcements, it sealed off those left behind. Cities once declared fortresses now became anchors, dragging whole divisions down with them. By the end of the day, many German units no longer knew where they were in the big picture. All they knew was that the Red Army was in front of them and behind them, and the skies no longer belonged to them. Collapse didn't come with screams, it came with emptiness, as if every option had been taken away all at once. And once that breakthrough was complete, the war entered its most brutal phase. Soviet spearheads quickly linked up behind German defensive clusters, closing massive encirclements. Cities that once served as anchors of resistance became the centers of deadly pockets. Inside them, tens of thousands were trapped, low on ammunition, food, information, and most of all, without any way out. In Vitebsk, in Bobruisk, in Minsk. The catastrophe was no longer a possibility, it was unfolding by the hour. Places once marked as strategic strongholds became mass graves, not because the defenders didn't fight, but because they had no other choice. The attack on June 22 didn't end when the guns fell silent. It was merely the doorway to the most horrifying stage of the campaign. From that moment on, history would no longer be shaped by breakthroughs, but by the tightening of nooses. And inside those nooses, the fate of an entire army group was being sealed. When the Red Army's spearheads closed in behind the German lines, the war in Belarus entered a phase more brutal than anything that had come before. This was no longer about capturing positions. It was about closing circles, and in those tightening circles, time became the deadliest enemy of all. Vitebsk was where the illusion shattered first. Declared a fortress, the city embodied everything wrong with Berlin's defensive mindset. German divisions were ordered to hold their ground, even after both flanks had collapsed. When Soviet forces linked up behind them, the encirclement formed almost instantly. Inside, tens of thousands of soldiers realized they were no longer part of the front. They were a pocket, isolated in a sea of fire. The Soviet artillery didn't need to hammer relentlessly. It fired methodically, sector by sector, layer by layer. The Air Force circled all day, turning every attempt at regrouping or counterattack into hopeless chaos. Supply lines were severed. Communication became a trickle of fragmented reports. Hour by hour, the circle didn't close faster. It closed tighter, with exhaustion as its engine. Desperate breakout attempts unfolded with no coordination, no real fire support. Just clusters of men trying to slip through gaps the enemy had already anticipated. Few made it. Most were cut down or captured when they could no longer fight. Vitebsk didn't fall in a single battle. It was ground down day by day until its name remained only on the map. In Bobruisk, the tragedy took on a different but no less horrific shape. There, an entire German army was swallowed by a perfect blend of terrain and Soviet strategy. As Red Army thrusts pushed deeper, the only retreat path led through swampy forests and rivers. Dirt roads, already treacherous, turned into killing grounds under constant air and artillery fire. Vehicles got stuck, formations disintegrated. Men were herded into spaces with no defensible ground. Bobruisk didn't look like a battle. It looked like a hunted retreat. Units lost contact with each other. All they knew was that the circle was closing behind them, and ahead lay walls of fire. Many abandoned heavy weapons just to move faster, but that only bought them a few more hours before being stopped. The Berezina marshes, once counted as a natural defense, became a death trap. Narrow paths, limited visibility, every movement exposed and punished. Tens of thousands were caught in a maze with no exit, where every step could be the last. Bobruisk wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of an entire command structure. But if Vitebsk and Bobruisk were blows that destroyed segments of the front, Minsk was the symbolic execution. The capital of Belarus, deep behind the original German lines, became the center of a massive encirclement. After punching through the gaps in the German defenses, Soviet forces advanced at a pace the enemy couldn't match. Scattered, isolated units fell back toward Minsk, hoping it could serve as a rally point, a place to regroup. But Minsk wasn't salvation. It was the final lid on the trap. When the circle closed, hundreds of thousands were trapped in a space growing smaller by the hour. Artillery from afar, airstrikes from above, partisans behind the lines. Every road out was blocked. There were no relief forces, no safe corridors, and no time to wait for a miracle. Inside the Minsk pocket, order disintegrated faster than anywhere else. Units mixed. Command collapsed. Soldiers fought in small bands or alone. Ammunition ran out. Food ran out. Wounded were left untreated. Each day became a struggle to survive, not to win. The most painful realization wasn't defeat, it was the sense of abandonment. The earlier orders to hold firm now meant nothing. There were no retreat plans, no backup options. What had once been called fortress gathering points, making it easier for the enemy to tighten the noose. In Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Minsk, the outcome was the same. They didn't lose a single battle. They were systematically erased. Each encirclement was a crushing machine, grinding non-stop until nothing remained. And when those pockets were squeezed dry, not only the soldiers disappeared, but the very structure of an army vanished with them. When the smoke began to clear, what emerged wasn't just burned out cities or roads littered with destroyed vehicles. What emerged was a massive void on the military map. Where once stood an army group with dozens of divisions, now there were only scattered fragments, not enough to even be called a fighting force. From that moment, the war in Belarus was no longer about isolated pockets. It became a story of disappearance, not retreat, not redeployment, erasure. And from that rubble, the world began to understand. This wasn't just a localized disaster. This was an irreversible turning point. The moment an entire army group, once the backbone of the Eastern Front, vanished from history. After the encirclements closed around Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Minsk, the battlefield in Belarus fell into a strange silence. Gunfire still echoed sporadically. Skirmishes still broke out. But the nature of the war had changed. This was no longer about winning or losing individual battles. This was the moment when history began tallying the consequences of a structural catastrophe. An entire army group had vanished. Not a disciplined retreat, not a strategic redeployment, but a collapse so complete it could not be reassembled. On German military maps, the familiar symbols for divisions, corps, and armies were being crossed out one by one. There were no arrows showing a way out, no new defensive lines drawn, only vast, silent voids where once a massive force had stood. Reports sent back to Berlin carried a tone of disbelief. The casualty numbers exceeded even the darkest predictions. It wasn't just men lost. It was the destruction of the entire supporting structure. Logistics, command, communications, depots were captured or destroyed, rail lines were cut, bridges blown, and even for the scattered groups who escaped the encirclement, there was nothing left to return to. No unit, no command, no system left to absorb them. What made this disaster different from Germany's earlier defeats was its totality. Stalingrad had been a shocking blow, but it could still be seen as an isolated tragedy. Kursk was a heavy loss, but the Wehrmacht kept its shape. In Belarus, what was destroyed was not just a fighting force, but the ability to conduct war along an entire strategic axis. When an army group disappears, it leaves behind more than a military gap. It leaves a psychological chasm. German units on other fronts quickly realized that Belarus wasn't a fluke. It was proof that the enemy could now do more than defeat them. They could erase them. The belief in recovery, the mindset that had helped the Wehrmacht bounce back from previous losses, began to unravel. At the command level, panic spread in silence. Emergency patches were thrown together, moving in units from elsewhere, drawing new defensive lines, trying to restore order. But every plan ran into a cold truth. There was no time left, and no strength left to fill the breach. The German war machine, once defined by speed and initiative, was now reduced to a sluggish, reactive posture, stripped of flexibility. Worse still, this failure couldn't be hidden. Unlike defeats that could be blamed on local conditions or tactical mistakes, the disappearance of an entire army group was beyond spin. Even under censorship, news spread, enough to plant seeds of doubt among soldiers and civilians alike. If such a large force could vanish in a matter of weeks, what awaited those who remained? On the Soviet side, the victory was not met with noisy celebration. It was received as a necessary step in a longer campaign. Stavka didn't revel in enemy losses. They looked at the map and saw something more important. A door to the west had opened. Belarus, once seen by Berlin as a stable buffer, was now an empty corridor. Each kilometer the Red Army advanced no longer came at the old cost. Resistance still existed, but it was fragmented, uncoordinated, and incapable of reversing the tide. What remained of the Wehrmacht in the east looked like broken pieces trying to reassemble, while the Red Army had already moved into its phase of strategic exploitation. And here, when one looked at the results of Operation Bagration, not through the lens of battles, but with the cold clarity of the whole, a terrifying realization took shape. This war had passed a point of no return. There was no longer a path for Germany to regain balance. No tactical miracle could undo what had just been structurally lost. From the moment an army group disappeared from the map, the war was no longer about whether the Third Reich could hold the Eastern Front. It became a darker, larger question. When would Germany collapse, and how many lives would it cost to open the road to Berlin? And that question marked the beginning of history's final chapter, the point of no return. When the smoke cleared over the forests and swamps of Belarus, the war didn't stop, but it changed direction. Not with noise, not with declarations, not with a dramatic moment etched in iconic imagery. The shift happened quietly, and that made it far more terrifying. Operation Bagration wasn't just a major Soviet victory. It was the moment the axis of the entire European war was shattered. Until then, Germany still clung to a fragile belief that it could hold on. After Stalingrad, they called it a fluke. After Kursk, they said it was a tactical setback. Each blow hurt, but there were still explanations. Still hope that with enough discipline, enough defense, time might yet turn in their favor. Bagration erased all of that. For the first time, the Wehrmacht didn't just lose a battle, it lost the ability to conduct war on a strategic front. This was no longer a matter of local wins and losses. No longer a question of shuffling units, patching lines, or waiting for a counterattack window. After Belarus, there was no next time to fix anything. All that remained was the slow prolonging of the inevitable. What made Bagration the point of no return was this. It destroyed time. Time to reorganize. Time to learn from mistakes. Time to find some last-minute political or military solution. From the summer of 1944 onward, each passing day only worsened Germany's position. The Red Army no longer paid a heavy price for each advance. They advanced because there was no one left strong enough to stop them. From Belarus to Warsaw, from Warsaw to the Oder, and finally to Berlin, that road was no longer blocked by unbroken walls of steel, only scattered checkpoints, desperate standoffs. Cities turned into reluctant fortresses. Each place would cost more lives, but none could change the course of history. In reverse, the effects of Bagration stretched far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped post-war Europe. The lands the Red Army liberated or occupied after this campaign would never return to their old place in the balance of power. Borders, regimes, alliances, all began to redraw themselves from the moment the Belarus front collapsed. And at the deepest level, Bagration was a brutal reminder of what modern war truly is. Disaster doesn't always come from where the noise is loudest. Sometimes it's prepared in silence, hidden beneath routine, and strikes precisely where people feel safest. For the Third Reich, Belarus was not the final battlefield, but it was where fate was sealed. From that point on, every road led to a single end. And history, as always, does not look back to wait for those who missed their last chance. When we look back on Operation Bagration, what lingers is not just the cold numbers of divisions wiped out or the arrows on the map surging westward. What haunts us is the way history unfolded, quietly prepared, patiently waited for, then delivered in a single, irreversible blow. Bagration wasn't the largest battle. It wasn't filled with mythologized moments of heroism. It was a campaign of clarity, of strategic intellect, and of one ruthless truth. When a machine has rotted from the inside, it only takes a well-placed touch for the whole thing to collapse. From the forests of Belarus to the roads that led to Berlin, the fate of the Third Reich had been sealed in the summer of 1944. What followed were the final chapters, written in blood, but unable to change the ending. And that is why Bagration was more than a military triumph. It was a profound lesson in history about the illusion of safety, the cost of complacency, and how modern war shows no mercy for strategic error. If you have thoughts on Operation Bagration or on the quiet yet decisive turning points of World War II, share your perspective in the comments below. History comes alive when it's seen from many angles. And if you want to continue exploring the stories of war, told deeply, slowly, and with care, don't forget to subscribe to History War so you won't miss the next chapter in the moments that shaped our world.